We human beings can get stuck in a lot of hurt and anger, particularly when we've been grossly wronged or harmed. Find out what we can learn about restoring our sense of inner peace from a restorative justice specialist next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. There are people who have been harmed so grievously that the concept of forgiveness feels invalidating or even toxic to them, and yet they have found a way to move forward and transform the energy of hurt, the energy of anger, the energy of resentment, and even hatred to one of peace. How do they do this, and what can we learn from them? Well, tonight we're going to learn about restorative justice dialogues, the paradox of forgiveness, and how we can apply some of these lessons to our own life. You can be a part of tonight's discussion by calling the numbers on your screen right now. Locally, dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. We'll be answering your questions throughout tonight's show. Joining me tonight is Ted Lewis, the Director of Communications for the Center for Restorative Justice and Peacemaking at the University of Minnesota and co-author of the book, The Energy of Forgiveness. And I have this book right here, The Energy of Forgiveness, Lessons from Those in Restorative Dialogues. And you can order this on Amazon.com. That's where I got the book. And after the show, not right now because I want you to watch the show, but after the show, I want you to go to your computer and go to Amazon and order this book. It is a fantastic book, and I think just has a lot to teach us, some of which we're going to be talking about tonight. To me, I found the book very inspirational, and we're so fortunate to have one of the co-authors here, so thank you very much for coming here this evening and sharing your wisdom with us. And I think a really good place for us to start, because I know a lot of people don't know the concept of restorative justice or what a restorative dialogue is. And I think that is like, let's get all of us on the same page about what is a restorative dialogue.
Right, there's a big continuum there where it might apply to a 10-year-old who, did some vandalism. It might apply to someone who did a murder. And there's a dialogue opportunity that's voluntary between the victim and the offender. And then there's also dialogues that might involve large communities. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was based on restorative principles. And I think the main ingredients are providing a safe space where people can talk about the harms. They can try to understand a little bit about who really owns the harms, and then there's usually discussion about how are those harms repaired. So there's some kind of reparation dimension to that.
And when in a justice process do these kind of dialogues typically occur, and how do people even come to say, I want to participate in a restorative dialogue?
The largest area of activity is within juvenile justice, often at the diversion level. So before it would even go into a court setting, there's a referral to a program. It might be a mediation program. It might be a community-based program that does conferencing or circling. And yet it's the same kind of dialogue can happen at any point along the spectrum of the justice process. So a judge could order it. Victims could request it years after a sentence with someone who's already in prison. Schools can use it as a disciplinary model. So it's across the board.
So they're all different entry points. And one of the things that I heard you say where a victim could request that even years after sentencing is that it doesn't have necessarily a shelf life then for it. Like if you don't do it within this time frame, you've lost your opportunity.
Right. And I think a big principle is the idea of empowerment. A lot of times people going into a justice process can feel like the power has been taken away from them because other people are deciding things. And so a dialogue process is really empowering both an offender party and a victim party to have as much conversation as they feel like they need. And that's why it really needs to be voluntary.
And it's voluntary on both ends then?
Even if an offender is referred from the justice system to a program, there's always a preparatory time. And in that preparation, a facilitator or mediator or a program manager is going to find out from an offender party, are you willing to go forward? Because if they're kind of arm twisted to go forward, that's not going to make a victim feel very good. They want to know that that person is stepping up to the plate, taking some responsibility, and aiming to make things right.
Because one of the things that we're really looking for here is authentic and genuine communication then.
Right. And the court process has its place in order to protect the rights of people, but it can often restrict information, it can restrict communication. I've talked to victims before who said, I couldn't even see their face. I wanted to make eye contact. And when they finally have the chance to sit face to face, eye to eye, after good preparation, that means a lot to them because they can really get a read. Is this person being serious? Are they going to turn it around? Are they going to not repeat this again? That can only really happen when you're in that energy zone close by with the other person.
And one of the things that one of the stories I was really struck by was the story of, this is one of the extreme stories. It was of a gentleman who had killed a woman's father, and it was the daughter and the offender were in this dialogue together. And one of the things that I felt so powerful about the story was that the offender said, it's really important for me to let you know that your father did nothing to provoke my rage. And he talked about, the story tells us that he talked about the idea that he wasn't allowed, that information was not allowed to come forward in court. And so that the restrictiveness sometimes of the judicial system can work not just with the victim, but with the offender then as well.
Right. And whereas a simple theft case for a 17-year-old might be an hour, 2-hour long meeting, these cases like the one you're describing in prison could be 5 or 6 hours. They might have to take a lunch break, but the idea is to create enough elbow room where everything that can be said, everything that needs to be heard can be heard. And typically what we find from research is that the victims who go through that process, they might go in with nervousness and apprehension. Some go in the case you're talking about, a lot of anger, a lot of resentment. But by the end, there's some kind of a shift where they no longer feel like they're carrying that weight, and they'll use language to say, I feel freer, I got my life back again, I can breathe again. And so we're trying to examine what really allows for that shift to happen in that dialogue process.
What do we know, or what does the research tell us about who even agrees to go into a restorative dialogue?
It's interesting. There's a lot of variety there, but what it really comes down to is a victim who has enough courage to go into the journey of thinking, I need to sit down face to face with this person. I want it for a number of reasons. They might feel like they need some answers to questions they don't have, or they might feel like they're ruminating with a lot of anger and hatred, and they know, I don't want to be that person inside because it's eating me up. I have to do something to kind of ground out that excess negative energy charge so I can have my life back again. And it's different for every victim. Some see the opportunity there in seed form and they start to go after it. Others, it's very difficult to even consider doing that because that's a monster. That's not a human being. And so a good preparation process is really helping that victim to come to terms with why they want to do it, so that when they finally enter it, they're prepared for the best possible conversation.
And then is part of that preparation about managing expectations about what a restorative dialogue can produce?
It can. Sometimes a facilitator will explain you know, I've met with the offender now a couple times, and I want you to realize this is kind of where he's at with some of his challenges and issues. But that helps the victim get a reality check. And so there's a bit of a back and forth trust building process before you would bring two people together like that. Typically in a prison, and a lot of times prisons that don't have a lot of precedent or history for this, there's a bit of resistance. A warden might think, you know, you're going to meet with who, you know? But one of the interesting things that I've found in some of the interviews I've done with victims who have chosen to do this is that once they sit down, you know, with a facilitator helping, maybe a support person, but once they sit down right at the beginning with that offender, something kind of breaks open about this is really a human being. And it's not uncommon for the offender early on to be crying or weeping out of the remorse that they have. And that can really shift the energy of a victim who's thinking, you know, is this a monster that I'm having a dialogue with?
And who has maybe held that perception for quite a long period of time because the act was monstrous, perhaps.
Yeah.
The act itself was monstrous. And that to me is amazing, that ability to agree to make oneself vulnerable again. And
that's a key word. And really both sides are vulnerable to go into it.
yes.
But there's a paradox there, because if you're willing to not feel like you have to have full control, but are able to go into that vulnerable zone, there's almost like a greater gift that comes to you as a result of it. And time again, we find people use that language of, this was a real gift to me to do this.
Are there times where a restorative, people enter in stating that they want to participate in a restorative dialogue and then that doesn't move forward?
There might be some reasons. If, you know, we always want there to be an appropriateness for the timing of a dialogue. And some of the things that would limit that appropriateness is if the offender is minimizing their responsibility. If an offender is not really saying, I did this and I'm willing to make amends and go down that journey, that's not going to feel very good to a victim who's needing more validation for, you know, I didn't bring this tragedy into my life and I'm still trying to make sense out of it. And so we want to work further with an offender who's still minimizing their role, and so that they're more softened to the fact that, you know, once you enter into that dialogue with the victim, you really need to be able to hear what they're saying and have some responses to that.
Here's a great question from a man in Duluth who asks, how do you keep victims from considering retaliation during the reconciliation process or the dialogue process? Or maybe how I might phrase that a little bit is, how do we keep this at a level that's you know, not
right.
victimizing of each other, I guess.
Right, and that's one reason why a lot of wardens are leery of this, because they think a victim only wants to kind of get back or to get even or to just verbally slap the offender. So this is where the preparation part is so important. These preparation times for severe and violent crimes can take 6 to 12 months. And there might be 4, 5, 6 individual meetings with each party. And so a facilitator really has to have that high level of predictability that this is going to be a safe conversation. And that doesn't mean emotions can't come out. Those emotions, it might be anger, it might be resentment, they can be freely taught, but they're going to be expressed in a constructive way, in a way that's not demeaning. And the offender will understand that they need to be able to they have to sit there and sometimes listen to those hard feelings. But that's part of the releasing of all of that negative pressure, so that both parties can kind of bridge back and really hear each other on a deeper human level.
And so that gets back to, again, that authentic and genuine communication. In the book, it talks about this sort of deep listening from the heart.
Mm-hmm.
And talk a little bit about what that is exactly, because we hear a lot about active listening and
Right.
how to do active listening, and this is a little bit beyond active listening. Explain to the audience what that means.
Sure. Deep listening is really what I call a heart-based listening. It's a listening that gets beyond having a skill or a technique or a reply strategy. A lot of times mediators or facilitators can be coached in those kinds of active listening skills. But heart-based listening is one that really listens to the entire being of the other person and takes into account their feelings, their nonverbals. And we use the phrase, even teenagers use the phrase, we had a good heart-to-heart. And what that really means is both of them kind of got beyond that level of awkwardness. They were really hearing each other. They were going back and forth, opening each other's trust up a little more. And I think deep listening is essentially a listening that gets people into that heart-to-heart zone where they're free to say things they might not have even expected to say.
And so I think that what you just said was really important. It's not that like there's a script for this. Like the preparation is not about building a script. Victim says this, offender says that.
No. In fact, at this level, especially in prison dialogues, the mediator, facilitator gets out of the way. They literally will back up their chair because this is a conversation now between two people that need each other. And you talk about this isn't a scripted thing. This is where forgiveness is really needs to be understood in a sensitive way. Restorative justice does never want to prescribe forgiveness as an expectation. It's just not even on the radar. If a victim within their own perspective and their own language, if it's important for them to talk about forgiveness, then that's fine. But they should never really come into it with thinking this has to be done for a good outcome.
Or for like that's the end goal.
No.
And so I think that that's how a lot of people view this, right? Or that there's this social expectation or social pressure that the concept of forgiveness is to let bygones be bygones, and that is not really probably what the goal is going to be for a lot of people. And I think is that maybe where a lot of people feel the concept of forgiveness is just toxic to them.
Yeah, they can get stuck, and it's understandable because people think forgiveness is like a free pass, a pardon, letting it be, let's forget about it. But what we're finding is that there's a paradoxical dimension around forgiveness in this context, because if you prescribe it, and if those expectations, even religious expectations are there, it tends to thwart the depth of that healing process in the dialogue. But if it's not prescribed, and if the language isn't even there, we're finding that people are more free to enter that experiential zone of connecting with each other, sharing their pain, their hardship, and then that leads to that release and relief experience where by the end they're going, wow, where is that pain? I just don't feel that negative energy weight anymore.
So that gets me to the title of the book then, The Energy of Forgiveness. Talk a little bit about even what that title means, because so it's this like if we don't use the word forgiveness, we're more likely to get to that energy, and yet sort of forgiveness is in the title of the book.
Right.
And what is meant by just that concept of the energy of forgiveness?
We often use it as a metaphor, but I think new research is suggesting, the heart, which can go up, can be healthy with no stress or unhealthy with a lot of stress. It's that area of study. And I think a good picture is a storm system where eventually there's thunder and lightning. You've got all sorts of things rubbing, and there's friction, and there's a buildup of an excess amount of negative charge. And if that excess area gets too close to an area where there's a deficient area, you're going to have a lightning bolt. And that's one reason why we all kind of avoid conflict to start. We don't want to be part of that negative energy zone where there's lightning flashing. So a crime creates all of that friction, that rubbing, that discomfort, and the greater the crime, the more discomfort and pain. I mean, there's the pain of the loss of the loved one in a murder case, but then you have the hassle of your life being upset and turned upside down, and that causes a lot of pain. So the energy of forgiveness is really what I would consider to be the diffusing or the dissolving of those negative emotional areas within people and even between people, to the point where it's transformed into a more positive experience, where people feel like they have good will toward the other person. The other person's a human being that they can care about. And so we talk about an energy shift from that negative emotional zone to a positive zone.
And when we all know that when we feel really angry about anything, like we all have the feeling, we all have felt anger in our body before, and that feels physically uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. There's that sense of agitation and that buildup. And I imagine if you're carrying around hurt and anger like that year after year, we know that that's not healthy for you,
right.
Number one. So that the transformative energy of forgiveness that you're talking about then is really about the release of that negative energy and more of this a comfort feeling than
yes.
in the body, and that people, I'm sure, feel like they can feel in their heart then as well.
And that's why it's called a gift. People discover it as a gift, and if there's not the chance for dialogue, even a victim on their own can go through that forgiveness journey and come to that point. But what we're finding is that when there's the dialogue and an offender is truly remorseful, making efforts to improve their own lives, has a sense of empathy for the victim, that really facilitates a greater opportunity for the victim to experience that sense of what we call completion and closure. Because now it's not like they've had to do all that work of finding peace of mind on their own. The other person has now given them the gift of information, of empathy, of understanding, of validation, and that amazingly helps that pain to kind of dissolve. It's almost like the negative energy is grounded and is no longer in the air anymore.
And Don and Mary Strufert were on the show last year, and they had, of course, participated in a restorative dialogue. And I remember what was so striking. One of the things that Mary said that she learned was that she had to learn, and what she learned from the experience was that she would just have some questions that would never be answered. And so some questions are answered, and other times it sounds like what happens is that you come to an understanding that I have to make peace with the fact that maybe I need to stop asking the question in my head.
Yes.
And that the dialogue helps you to see that in a way that you couldn't maybe see that before, and that brings a sense of peace.
Yeah.
I was struck too in the book by this concept of the fact that both accountability and compassion could sit side by side with each other.
Sure.
And that the goal was not to be forgiving and only about compassion, and that the offender shouldn't be held accountable at all.
There are some offenders who will say, this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And even some who know about restorative justice options will sometimes avoid it because they'd rather have a traditional punishment. And so what we're finding is that when you can combine the dignified support of an offender with true accountability, where they take responsibility, that those things aren't an inverse relationship, but they rise together. And all of that unfortunate talk about hard on crime, soft on crime, the thing about that framing is it makes accountability and support opposite from each other. Like if you're going to support an offender, somehow you're not being tough on crime. And then vice versa, if you're soft on crime, it means no accountability, but all this support. Well, that's a false framing, because when you bring both of them together, that's when they both actually work with each other to help an offender change. And ultimately, we want offenders to be changing, coming out of prisons, not reoffending. And I think that's why restorative justice now is becoming a bipartisan interest at the political level, because it's less costly and it's showing that it really helps victims and it's helping offenders to change the best they possibly can.
We're coming to the end of our time here. What would you have as closing words for our viewing audience?
I think, we've been talking a bit about how serious this is for murder cases and victims choosing to go to prisons with great courage. But the same principles apply all the way down to teenagers who need to learn how to make an apology, who need to learn how to make reparation, for victims to have a voice in that kind of process. These are daily things, and you can take it out of the criminal realm into the family realm or the workplace realm. How do you build cultures of trust and apology and healthy communication? This stuff cuts across the whole spectrum of human conflict.
Accountability and compassion really in any community that we're talking about, or in any peoples in dialogue that we're talking about then.
Right.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you for joining us. And so what did we learn here? I think one of the things that we learned is that we really want to be compassionate human beings, and with the idea that all of us have the capacity to change when given the opportunity to do so. That's the compassion piece, and as Ted just said, we want to have the accountability piece too. We see that a lot in families as well, where we don't just want to be accountable without compassion or compassion without accountability. Don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links. And join us again next week when our topic will be Parenting 101. 5 simple ways to grow healthy kids. That's emotionally healthy kids, because this is a mental health show. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.